studying the Old Testament, and we've been looking at a number of books: Malachi, Nehemiah, Ezra, Zechariah, and Haggai, and they all deal with the nation of Judah, and more specifically Jerusalem. And we've been looking at a macro view, if you will, the fate of an entire nation that had been taken into captivity in Babylon. And then the Persians had released them from captivity, but many of them had elected to stay in Persia. And so we now look at a micro view of millions of Jews that had remained in Persia. And we see King Ahasuerus, who's not a believer, but has married a woman named Esther. And we found yesterday that the nation of Israel is in great difficulty, great problems, because there is a person within the king's realm who is about ready to annihilate all of the Jews through an edict that he obtained from the king through anger, alcohol, and pride. And it's quite an interesting thing, because we learn today that, and this is really a good truth for all of us to understand, both in the political realm and also in personal realm and in the church realm, and that is that one person can have a tremendous influence on what happens. And here in this case, one man, Haman, had caused the possible demise of an entire race or nation of people. In just 11 months, a date was set for all of them to be killed. And we also saw that in the same way that one man could do that, it appears that one woman could have an effect to alter that event, and that those people would not be annihilated. And so it's a very interesting story, and a historical event that is still celebrated today by the Jews. It's a festival called Purim, and it acknowledges this historical event and celebrates the final outcome of the event. And so we're going to pick up the story today in chapter 4. And we're going to look at just a few verses today. We're not going to read large sections of scripture, but we're going to look at verse 8 and 11 and think about those. And then we'll come back to verse 14 and then finally close out with our application for today. So let's take a look at Esther chapter 4, verses 8 and 11. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict which had been issued in Susa for their destruction, and that he might show Esther and inform her, in order for her to go to the king to implore his favor and to plead with him for her people. All the king's servants and the people of the king's province know that for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter, so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. Mordecai has received a copy of the edict of the Jews being annihilated, and he's being forced to use a messenger to relay things back and forth to Esther. The first verse, verse 8, deals with him sending the messenger back to Esther with a copy of the actual decree that would show her not only the payment of money for the king's treasury as a result of the edict, but also the fact that Mordecai was very much concerned about the people and about this edict, and wanted Esther to know fully well that she had to try to intercede between the people and the king. However, when Esther received this message from Mordecai, she had to reply back to him the grave danger that put her in. For it was a rule of the court that no one could go to the king unless he sent for them. And if they did go to him and he didn't reach out his scepter to them, they would be forced by law to be killed. And so Esther knew, having not been summoned to the king for over 30 days, that she was going to have to go to him instead of him coming to her. And that if he didn't reach out the scepter to her, that she would have to, by law, be killed. So literally, Esther's life was at risk here. But so was the life of the entire nation of the people of Israel that were there residing in Persia. Quite a dilemma if you can realize just how grave this danger was. So now let's take a look at verse 14, because it is the key verse of this section of Scripture. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have obtained royalty for such a time as this? Now, Mordecai, remember, was the adoptive father of Esther. He had raised her. She had been an orphan. He loved her, and he loved her very much. And yet he was asking her to take the risk of losing her own life for the good of a whole nation. Well, typology is an interesting study. Typology says sometimes we find shadowy pictures in the Old Testament of events that would occur in the New Testament. As a matter of fact, many of those that study typology say that in almost every book of the Bible, there is a type for Jesus. That is, somebody that in some ways resembles Jesus and what he would do for us, that he would sacrifice his life for us, that he would care about us that much. And so in typology, Esther is a type for Christ. That is, that she was willing to sacrifice her own life for others. And Jesus certainly sacrificed his life for us. So as we look at this and we recognize that Mordecai has told Esther, yes, maybe that's why God ordained that you be the queen, so that you might save a whole nation. And maybe that's why God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. Interesting parallel, isn't it? Well, what are the applications for this particular lesson in Esther? Well, the first one is that one man or woman could have a tremendous negative or positive impact on an entire nation. Think about it. One man or one woman that could have a tremendous impact on a nation. Secondly, that one man or one woman could prevent or alter those events that could be good or bad. And thirdly, we must ask God for discernment. Whether or not God has anointed us for a certain time, a certain place, a certain action that we should take. And then will we be willing to work within God's will? Well, I can only tell you as a pastor of 35 years that there are many times when I believe God ordained me to meet someone, to share the good news of Jesus Christ with them, and whose life was altered as a result. I can only tell you that there were times when I did marriage counseling when I believed that God ordained that I come and intercede on God's behalf and place such words in my mouth as to bring that couple back together again and to work through their marriage difficulties. Ordained times when I was to console or to comfort someone in a deep loss or a tragic situation. Yes, I have to believe God does ordain us for certain times in our lives. He may not make us a king or a queen, as he did with Esther, but he may have ordained a time and a place for you. And you need to pray for God's discernment for that time and that place when he wants you to have an impact. Hopefully, it's always going to be for good and not for evil, or to avoid evil. But nevertheless, I think that we can learn from Esther far more than the simple lesson that God placed her to place where she could save a nation, but that we might apply it to our own lives and recognize that God has placed us in certain places, certain situations, certain places of authority, so that we might make a difference, or that we might have the discernment to see someone that is making a negative difference seriously and have an opportunity to be an influence to change bad into good, or to perhaps bring about good. And that's my thought for the day. God bless you and have a wonderful day.